The frozen earth fought her, a stubborn, unfeeling thing that stole the warmth from her fingers and offered nothing in return. Each handful of mud and stone she clawed from the shallow depression was a fresh torment, the cold seeping through her skin and into her bones until it felt as though her very marrow was turning to ice. Her nails were broken, her knuckles raw and bleeding, but Alara didn't feel the pain. The only feeling was a hollow, cavernous emptiness in her chest, a void where a tiny, flickering life had been only yesterday. The wind howled across the prairie, a keening sound that mimicked the scream trapped in her own throat. It tore at her thin dress, the fine city fabric now a tattered rag caked in filth, a pathetic remnant of a life that was no longer hers. This was all she had left. A merciless sky, a pitiless wind, and the terrible final duty of a mother. She had wrapped her son, her little Thomas, in the only clean piece of cloth she owned, a small lace handkerchief embroidered with her initials. It was a foolish, fragile shield against the crushing weight of the world, but it was all she could give him. With a sob that was ripped from the deepest part of her soul, she laid his small, still form in the crude grave. The ground was not a cradle. It was a thief. It had taken everything, and soon it would take her too. Bartholomew Croft, the man who had promised her a new life, had cast her out with the same casual cruelty he might show a lame horse. The boy was weak, he had sneered, his face impassive as her world collapsed. A weak bloodline is a contagion. I'll have no more of it. He had turned his wagon train, a lumbering beast of commerce and ambition, and left her on the plains with her dying child and the clothes on her back. He had not even looked back. Now, as she pushed the cold, wet dirt over her son's body, a finality settled over her. This was the end. The frontier was not a land of opportunity. It was a place of endings, a vast, unmarked graveyard, and she was digging her own grave right next to her son's. The last rays of sunlight clung to the western hills, painting the bruised sky in shades of orange and purple, a beautiful mocking farewell. She sank back on her heels, the last of her strength gone. The cold was a comfort now, a promise of numbness, of peace. She closed her eyes, willing the wind to carry her away, to scatter her across this desolate land until she was nothing but dust and a forgotten memory. Have you ever felt a despair so profound it felt like the end of the world? A moment where the earth beneath your feet seems to fall away, leaving you in a cold, silent freefall with nothing to hold on to? This is a story about that moment. It's the story of a woman who lost everything and a man who had already lost it all. It is a story about the harshest of winters, both in the world and in the human heart. But it is also a story about the ground itself, the very earth that takes so much, and how sometimes, in the most unexpected way, it can give something back. On the edge of that same unforgiving prairie, miles from the shallow grave that marked the death of Alara's hope, a man named Silas watched the storm gather. He stood on the porch of his small, solitary cabin, a fortress of hewn logs against the vast emptiness. The wind, his only constant companion, whispered through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and something else, a scent of sorrow so palpable it was almost human. Silas was a man carved from the same hard granite as the mountains that loomed behind his home. A veteran of a war that had fractured the nation and his own soul, he had come west not to build a future, but to escape a past. The ghosts of his wife and daughter, taken by fever while he was away fighting for a cause he no longer understood, were etched into the deep lines on his face. He had built this cabin with his own 2 hands, built it as a mausoleum for his heart. He wanted nothing from the world and expected the world to want nothing from him. But as the first flakes of snow began to drift down, thick and wet, his horse, old Jeb, shifted nervously in the paddock. Silas's eyes, trained to see the slightest disturbance in the landscape, caught a flicker of movement near the creek bed. It was wrong. It was a shape that did not belong, a patch of darkness against the whitening ground. Duty, a thing he thought he had buried long ago, stirred within him. With a sigh that plumed in the frigid air, he pulled on his heavy coat, grabbed his rifle, and strode out into the nascent blizzard. He found her half submerged in a snowdrift, a dusting of white already covering her dark hair like a premature shroud. She was unconscious, her face as pale as the snow she lay in, her lips a faint, tragic blue. He saw the state of her dress, the ruin of her hands, and his gut tightened. This was not a lost traveler. This was a soul cast away. For a long moment he considered leaving her. It would be the easier thing, the safer thing. Bringing her into his home would be bringing in the world he had fled, a world of pain and complication. But then he saw the small, embroidered handkerchief clutched in her frozen hand, and the ghost of his little girl, of a tiny hand clutching his own, rose up before him. With a curse directed at God, or fate, or his own stubborn heart, he gently lifted the woman into his arms. She weighed almost nothing. She was a broken bird, a fragile thing that the storm had tried to claim. As he carried her back to the cabin, the world disappearing behind a curtain of swirling snow, he didn't know that he wasn't just saving a stranger from the cold. He was carrying the first flicker of warmth back into the frozen tomb of his own life. The cabin was a cocoon of warmth and the scent of pine smoke. For days, Alara drifted in a feverish haze, a twilight world between the living and the dead. She was vaguely aware of a presence, a large, quiet shadow that moved with a heavy, deliberate tread. It spooned warm broth between her lips, a liquid that tasted of salt and sustenance. It piled thick wool blankets over her shivering form and stoked the fire in the stone hearth until its flames danced like captive spirits, casting flickering light on the log walls. She would wake sometimes to find him sitting in a chair across the room, cleaning a rifle or mending a piece of leather, his face illuminated by the firelight. He was a mountain of a man, with a beard streaked with gray and eyes that held the quiet, weary sorrow of an old soldier. He never spoke to her, not in those first days. The silence in the cabin was as thick and as comforting as the blankets that covered her. It was a silence that demanded nothing. It allowed her grief to be a physical presence in the room, an uninvited guest that the silent man seemed to acknowledge with a solemn, respectful nod. He was tending not just to her broken body, but to her shattered spirit, giving it the one thing it needed: time. Her first clear thought was of Thomas. The memory crashed down on her with the force of a physical blow, a pain so sharp and visceral it stole her breath. A silent scream built in her chest, but it had no sound. It was the scream of the void. She saw the man, her rescuer, look up from his work, his gaze meeting hers across the dim room. There was no pity in his eyes, a mercy for which she was profoundly grateful. Instead, there was a flicker of something she recognized, a shared understanding of loss that transcended words. He simply held her gaze for a moment, then rose and brought her a cup of water. He held it to her lips as she drank, his large, calloused hand steady and sure. The act was so simple, so fundamentally kind. It broke through a small crack in the wall of her despair. That night, she slept without the fever dreams. She dreamt of a quiet forest, of sunlight filtering through tall trees, a place of peace. When she woke, the morning light was streaming through the single window of the cabin, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air. The man was outside, the rhythmic thud of his axe splitting with a steady, reassuring heartbeat. She sat up, her body aching and weak, but the fever had broken. She looked around the small, sparse room. It was meticulously clean, a man's space, devoid of any softness save for the blankets she was wrapped in. A rifle rested above the mantelpiece. A small shelf held a handful of worn books. It was the home of someone who had stripped life down to its barest essentials. Shelter, warmth, survival. He came back inside, his arms loaded with firewood, snow clinging to his beard and the shoulders of his coat. He stopped when he saw her sitting up, his expression unreadable. For the first time he spoke to her, his voice a low rumble, like rocks shifting deep underground. "You're awake," he said. It was not a question, but a statement of fact. She could only nod, her throat tight with unshed tears and disuse. He stacked the wood by the fire, his movements economical and precise. "There's stew on the hearth," he added, not looking at her. "Eat." It was an order, but it was not unkind. It was the command of a man who understood that survival was a series of simple, non-negotiable actions. You eat, you stay warm, you keep breathing, one foot in front of the other. For the first time since she had clawed that small, terrible grave from the frozen earth, Alara felt a flicker of something other than despair. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was something far more fragile, more elemental. It was the simple animal instinct to live. She swung her legs out of the bed, her feet touching the cold, rough-hewn floorboards, and took the first shaky step back into the world. As winter held its iron grip on the land, a quiet rhythm established itself within the four walls of the cabin. It was a life measured not by conversation, but by shared tasks and the slow passage of light across the floor. Silas, as she learned his name would rise before dawn, his movements quiet so as not to wake her. He would venture out into the biting cold to tend to his horse and check his trap lines, returning with the silence of a ghost, his presence announced only by a gust of frigid air and the soft thump of firewood being set by the hearth. Alara, in turn, found purpose in the small domestic acts she had once taken for granted. At first, it was merely stirring the perpetual stew that simmered over the fire. Then, she found his mending basket, the clothes within worn and crudely patched. With a needle she found tucked away, her fingers, still tender but no longer raw, began the slow, meditative work of repair. Each stitch was a tiny act of reclamation, a small piece of order brought to a world of chaos. She mended his shirt, the rough wool a stark contrast to the silks she had once known, and when he returned and put it on without a word, a silent acknowledgement passed between them. He noticed the neater seams, the reinforced collar. She noticed that he noticed. Words were a currency they did not possess in abundance. When they did speak, the sentences were short, honed to a fine point. "The snow is deep today," he might say, and she would understand it as a warning to stay inside, a statement of fact that also carried the weight of his protection. "I found your tracks," she said one afternoon, looking out the window. He paused from cleaning his rifle. They were nearly covered. He simply nodded. "The wind is a liar out here. It'll tell you a story and then erase it an hour later." It was the longest speech he had yet made to her, and in it, she heard the wisdom of a man who had learned to read the land as other men read books. One day, he brought in a small, wounded rabbit from one of his traps, its leg caught but not broken. He was about to dispatch it when Alara stopped him with a quiet, "Wait." He looked at her, his expression questioning. She found a small piece of wood for a splint and some clean cloth. Working together, in that same profound silence, they set the creature's tiny leg. He held the trembling animal with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his formidable size, his large hands surprisingly deft. They kept the rabbit in a small box by the fire, and Alara found herself tending to it, feeding it scraps and water. It was a small, fragile life, a life she could nurture. It was not a replacement for what she had lost. Nothing could ever be. But it was a place to put the love that was dammed up inside her, a love that threatened to drown her in its grief. The day the rabbit was well enough to be released, they stood together on the porch. Silas opened the box, and the creature hesitated for a moment before darting off into the snow-covered woods. "It won't last long out there," Silas said, his voice flat. "A fox or a hawk will get it. But today it is free," Alara replied, her voice soft but firm. "And it has a chance. That's all any of us can ask for." He turned to look at her then, truly look at her. He saw not the broken, half-frozen woman he had carried from the snow, but a woman whose resilience was a quiet, unyielding force, like a sapling growing in the crack of a granite cliff. He saw the strength that had allowed her to survive the unthinkable. He had offered her shelter, but she was building her own fortress, not of logs and stone, but of quiet courage and a stubborn refusal to be completely extinguished. In that moment a subtle shift occurred. He was no longer just her protector. He was her witness. And she was no longer just a survivor. She was a testament to the enduring power of a single, precious chance. The first sign of the thaw came not from the land, but from within the cabin. It was a sound Alara hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. A small, dry chuckle. Silas was carving a piece of wood, a small bird taking shape under his knife, when the blade slipped, sending the half-finished object skittering across the floor. He grunted in frustration, and Alara, watching him, offered a small, hesitant smile. "Even the mountains crumble sometimes," she said softly. He looked up, surprised, then a slow, reluctant grin tugged at the corner of his mouth, and the sound escaped him. A rusty, unused thing, but a genuine sound of humor. It was a crack in the ice, and through it, the first light of spring seemed to pour. As the snows receded, revealing the muddy, sleeping earth beneath, the world outside the cabin began to mirror the changes within it. The silence between them, once a heavy blanket of shared grief, was now lighter, more comfortable, punctuated by easy conversation. He began to speak of the land, not with the terse warnings of winter, but with the quiet affection of a man who knew its secrets. He showed her which roots were good to eat, which birdsong heralded rain, how to read the stories left by deer and wolves in the soft mud. He took her to a high ridge overlooking his valley and, for the first time, spoke of his past. "My farm was in Ohio," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Good land. My wife, Mary, she could make anything grow. And our girl, Sarah, she was like a wildflower." He fell silent, the memories a weight he carried with a familiar stoicism. Alara did not offer empty platitudes or condolences. She simply stood beside him, a silent partner in his sorrow, just as he had been in hers. "I told her the story of my son," she said later that evening, the firelight playing on their faces. "Thomas. I told her how he had my father's eyes." Sharing the names of their dead was a profound intimacy, a bridging of two desolate pasts. It was an acknowledgement that they were both survivors of a shipwreck, washed ashore on this strange, isolated island of a life. One evening, a storm rolled in, a violent spring squall with thunder that shook the cabin to its foundations. A crash of lightning, terrifyingly close, made Alara jump, a cry escaping her lips. It was a primal, instinctual sound of fear, a relic of the trauma she had endured. In an instant, Silas was there, his hand on her shoulder, solid and grounding. "It's just the sky," he said, his voice a low anchor in the tempest. "It makes a lot of noise, but it'll pass." He didn't move his hand, and she didn't pull away. In that simple touch, a current of warmth and safety passed between them, a feeling that had nothing to do with the fire and everything to do with the man beside her. She leaned into his touch, just for a moment, closing her eyes and breathing in the scent of pine smoke and winter that clung to him. He was her shelter. His gruffness was the bark of a great old tree, and she was finally beginning to see the steady, living heartwood within. The storm did pass, leaving the air washed clean and smelling of wet earth and new life. As the last of the thunder rumbled away into the distance, they stood in a comfortable silence, his hand still resting on her shoulder. The cabin no longer felt like a refuge from the world. It felt like the center of it. It was home. He had rescued her from the winter, but she, with her quiet strength and unwavering grace, was rescuing him from a cold that had settled in his soul long before the snows had ever fallen. The peace of their reclaimed world was shattered by the distant, rhythmic beat of a horse's hooves. It was a sound that did not belong in their valley, an intrusion from the world they had both left behind. Silas heard it first, his head snapping up from the fence post he was mending. His body went rigid, the easy calm of the morning replaced by the coiled tension of a wolf scenting danger. He motioned for Alara, who was tending a small garden they had planted near the cabin, to get inside. His voice was low, urgent. Now, Alara. She didn't question him. She had come to trust his instincts as she trusted the rising of the sun. From the cabin's single window, they watched as a lone rider emerged from the treeline. He was not a trapper or a lost pioneer. He wore the clothes of a hired man, a pistol strapped low on his hip, and he rode with an arrogance that spoke of serving a powerful master. He reined his horse in before the cabin, his eyes sweeping over the small homestead with a dismissive sneer. "This is Croft land," he called out, his voice loud and grating. "Or it will be soon enough. Just scoutin' the territory for the boss." Silas stepped out onto the porch, his rifle held loosely in one hand. He did not raise it, but its presence was a clear, unspoken statement. "This is my land," Silas said, his voice flat and hard as stone. "Been my land for 5 years. I have the deed." The rider laughed, a short, ugly sound. "A deed's just a piece of paper. Mr. Bartholomew Croft, he deals in land, not paper. He'll be bringing the railroad through here soon. Best you take what he offers and move on, old man." The name, Croft, struck Alara like a physical blow. The air rushed from her lungs, and the cabin walls seemed to close in on her. The monster from her past, the man who had authored her ruin, was no longer a distant memory. He was a looming threat, his shadow stretching all the way to this small, hidden valley. The rider's eyes flickered toward the cabin window, catching a glimpse of her movement. His sneer widened. "Well, what have we here? Didn't figure you for the kind to have company, old-timer. Especially not one as pretty as that." Silas took a half-step forward, his knuckles white on the stock of his rifle. "State your business and ride on," he commanded, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. "My business is whatever Mr. Croft says it is," the man retorted, his hand drifting casually toward his pistol. "And I'll be sure to tell him about the charming scenery you've got up here. He appreciates fine things." With a final, insolent look, the man wheeled his horse around and galloped away, leaving a trail of dust and a suffocating silence in his wake. Alara stepped out onto the porch, her body trembling. The sanctuary they had built together had been breached. The outside world, with all its greed and cruelty, had found them. "He will come back," she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Silas turned to her, and his eyes, which had softened over the past months, were once again the hard, cold eyes of the soldier. But this time, their coldness was not directed at the world in general. It was focused, a chilling fire aimed at a specific threat. He reached out and took her hand, his grip firm and reassuring. "Let him come," he said, his voice a low, steady vow. "This is our home. I won't let him take anything else from you." In that moment, he was no longer just a man haunted by the past. He was a protector with a future to defend. And Alara, feeling the strength in his grip, knew she was no longer a victim fleeing a tyrant. She was a survivor standing her ground. The waiting was a quiet torment. For a week, every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of fear through Alara. The valley, once a place of healing solitude, now felt exposed, vulnerable. But Silas moved with a grim, focused purpose that calmed her frayed nerves. He was no longer just a homesteader. He was a soldier preparing a battlefield. He reinforced the cabin door, checked his supply of ammunition, and walked the perimeter of his land each morning and evening, his rifle a permanent extension of his arm. He showed Alara how to load and fire the spare pistol, his hands guiding hers with a steady patience. "You aim for the center," he instructed, his voice low and serious. "Don't think. Don't hesitate. You pull the trigger." She hoped she would never have to, but the weight of the weapon in her hand was a small, hard piece of agency in a world that had tried to strip her of all of it. The fragile peace they had cultivated had been replaced by a tense, shared resolve. They spoke little of the coming threat, but it was a constant, unspoken presence between them. The day Bartholomew Croft arrived, the sky was a brilliant, cloudless blue, a cruel mockery of the darkness he brought with him. He did not come alone. The scout from the week before was with him, along with 2 other men, all of them armed, all of them wearing the same look of casual menace. Croft sat atop a magnificent black stallion, his suit immaculate despite the dusty trail, a symbol of a world of wealth and power that had no place here. He looked at the small, rustic cabin with an expression of profound disgust, as if its very existence were an insult. "Silas, is it?" Croft called out, his voice smooth and laced with condescending authority. "I've come to make you a final offer for this property, a generous one, enough to set yourself up somewhere more suitable." Silas stood on the porch, his rifle held at his side. Alara was just inside the door, the pistol clutched in her hands, her heart hammering against her ribs. "This land is not for sale," Silas stated, his voice ringing with finality. Croft's gaze then slid past Silas to the open doorway, where he finally saw Alara. A slow, cruel smile spread across his face. Well, I thought I smelled something familiar. The stench of ingratitude. I should have known you'd survive. You're like a weed, aren't you? Clinging to life where you're not wanted." He dismounted, his movements fluid and arrogant. "I've come to collect what is mine. The woman. She is my property, a debt owed." "She owes you nothing," Silas growled, raising the rifle so it was pointed squarely at Croft's chest. "She is not property, and she is not yours." Croft laughed, a sound that was utterly devoid of warmth. "Oh, the backwoods philosopher. How quaint. You think that rifle and this pathetic little patch of dirt make you a king? I own this entire territory. I own the law. I own you. Now, step aside before my men are forced to correct your poor manners." He gestured to his men, who drew their weapons, the metallic click of hammers being cocked echoing in the tense silence. Croft's smile widened. He believed he had already won. He believed that power, wealth, and brute force were the only things that mattered in this world. He had made a fatal miscalculation. He had failed to account for the quiet strength of a woman who had already lost everything and the unyielding honor of a man who had finally found something to live for. The world seemed to shrink to the small patch of ground between the cabin porch and the four riders. The air was thick with the promise of violence, the scent of dust and sweat and fear. Croft, confident in his power, took a step toward the cabin. "I am a patient man," he said, his voice dripping with false reason. "But my patience has its limits. Give me the woman, and I will let you live out your miserable days on this rock pile." Silas didn't flinch. His eyes, cold and steady, remained locked on Croft. "You'll take her over my dead body. An arrangement that can be easily accommodated," Croft sneered, nodding to one of his men. The man began to raise his pistol, his aim settling on Silas. But in that split second, a blur of motion came from the side. Alara, no longer hiding in the shadows of the doorway, burst from the cabin. She wasn't running in fear. She was running with a purpose. In her hands, she held the heavy cast-iron skillet from the hearth, and with a desperate, primal scream, she flung it with all her might. It spun through the air and crashed into the side of the gunman's head with a sickening thud. He staggered, his shot going wild, splintering the wood of the porch railing as he collapsed to the ground. The sudden, unexpected attack threw the moment into chaos. It was the opening Silas needed. His rifle fired, the sound a deafening crack that sent the birds scattering from the trees. He didn't shoot to kill. His bullet struck the pistol from another man's hand, sending it flying into the dirt. In the same fluid motion, he worked the lever of the rifle, the empty cartridge ejecting as he swung the barrel toward the third man. But it was Croft who reacted next, his face a mask of incandescent rage. He drew his own elegant, silver-inlaid revolver and aimed it not at Silas, but at Alara. "You worthless creature!" he shrieked, his composure shattered. "I should have left you to the wolves." He fired. Alara cried out and stumbled backward, but not because she was hit. Silas had moved with a speed that defied his size, throwing himself in front of her, taking the bullet himself. He grunted in pain, the impact spinning him around, but he did not fall. Fueled by adrenaline and a ferocious will, he brought his rifle up and slammed the stock into Croft's jaw, sending the man sprawling into the dust. The last remaining gunman, seeing his master fall and his companions either unconscious or disarmed, lost his nerve. He threw his weapon down and raised his hands in surrender. It was over in less than a minute. The quiet valley was suddenly still, the only sounds the ringing in their ears, the pained groans of the man on the ground, and Silas's ragged breathing. Alara rushed to his side. "Silas, you're hurt." A dark stain was spreading across his shoulder. "It's nothing," he grunted, though his face was pale with pain. Just a scratch. He looked at Croft, who was struggling to sit up, spitting blood and curses. Then he looked at Alara, her face streaked with dirt, her eyes wide with fear and fierce, protective love. He had saved her, and she, in her own way, had saved him. Together, they had faced the dragon and won. The power of money and malice had proven to be no match for the simple, unbreakable power of two people standing together to defend their home. The threat was vanquished, not with an army, but with a skillet, a single bullet, and a shared, unwavering courage. 1 year later, the valley was awash in the golden light of late summer. The scars of the confrontation had healed, both on the land and on its inhabitants. Silas's shoulder had mended, leaving behind a puckered line of skin that he claimed made him look more distinguished. The men Croft had brought with him, including their master, had been bound and delivered to the nearest town with a U.S. Marshal, along with a detailed account of their crimes. Stripped of his aura of invincibility and facing a man of the law who could not be bought, Croft's empire of intimidation had crumbled. His threats to the valley were over for good. The cabin was no longer just a shelter. It was a home, filled with the small, comfortable signs of a shared life. Wildflowers Alara had transplanted from the meadow sat in a jar on the windowsill. A new, sturdy chair, built by Silas, sat beside her own rocker on the porch. The small garden had expanded, its neat rows pregnant with vegetables, a testament to their labor and their faith in the future. They had built a new life from the ashes of their old ones, a quiet, sturdy existence grounded in the rhythms of the seasons and the simple, profound comfort of each other's presence. One afternoon, Silas led Alara to a small, sun-dappled clearing a short distance from the cabin, shaded by a stand of whispering aspen trees. There, he had placed a single, smooth river stone, its surface unmarked. "I thought," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I thought you might want a place, a better place, to remember." He didn't need to say the name. Thomas was a gentle, quiet presence in their lives, a shared memory of a love that had been lost but not forgotten. Alara knelt and placed her hand on the cool, smooth stone. Tears welled in her eyes, but they were not the tears of bitter, hopeless grief she had shed on the prairie. They were tears of remembrance, of love, of a sorrow that had been softened by time and tenderness. This was not a grave born of desperation and abandonment. This was a memorial built from love and respect. She looked up at Silas, who stood watching her, his heart in his eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. "It was a thank you for everything. For the rescue, for the shelter, for the patience, for the shared silence, for the laughter, for the safety, for his life, for this new life." He reached down and pulled her to her feet, his hands enclosing hers. They stood there for a long time, the sun filtering through the leaves, the silence of the valley wrapping around them like a warm embrace. They had not spoken the words, not out loud. They didn't need to. Love for them was not a declaration. It was in the wood he chopped to keep her warm. It was in the meals she cooked to keep him strong. It was in the shared glance across a room, the comfortable silence on the porch at sunset. It was in this simple, perfect stone. They had both come to this wilderness to be alone, to let their wounds fester in solitude. But the ground, the very same ground that had been a place of burial and despair, had given them a second chance. It had given them each other. And as they walked back to the cabin, hand in hand, they were not two solitary people anymore. They were a family. In the deepest darkness, when it feels like the sun will never rise again, the human heart has a choice. It can surrender to the cold, allowing itself to be frozen by grief and despair. Or it can hold onto a single, tiny ember of hope, shielding it from the wind, nurturing it until it can once again grow into a flame. The story of Alara and Silas is a testament to that choice. It is a story that reminds us that strength is not the absence of fear or pain, but the courage to take one more step, even when every fiber of your being wants to lie down and be reclaimed by the dust. It shows us that home is not always a place we are born into, but a sanctuary we can build with someone who sees the light in us when we can only see the shadows. Their love was not born of whispered poetry or grand gestures, but forged in the harsh crucible of the frontier. It was a love built on shared silence, mutual respect, and the quiet, unwavering promise to stand as a shield against the storms of the world. They healed each other not by trying to erase the scars of the past, but by accepting them as part of the journey that led them to one another. Their story is a powerful reminder that even after the most devastating loss, the ground beneath our feet can offer us a second chance. It may not be the life we planned, but it can be a life of peace, of purpose, and of a love so profound it can make even the most desolate wilderness bloom. What part of their journey resonated with you the most? Was it Alara's resilience or Silas's quiet honor? Let us know in the comments below. Your stories and reflections are what build this community. And if you found inspiration in their tale of survival and love, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories that celebrate the unyielding strength of the human spirit. Thank you for watching.